subscribe to my YouTube channel. Share it with your Ethan Whitmore had always believed that a single moment could change everything. As a man who had worked tirelessly to climb to the top, he often reflected on his rise from an unknown entrepreneur to the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company. But today, as he stepped into his office building for what seemed like just another work day, he had no idea that this particular Friday would be different. It had been a long week. Whitmore Enterprises, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, was expanding rapidly, and Ethan had his hands full. Meetings, calls, and endless paperwork filled his calendar. The weight of his responsibilities felt heavier every day. He had grown used to the pressure, the expectations, and the constant race to stay ahead in a fast-paced industry. But as he entered the lobby of his building, something felt off, unsettling even. The air was thicker, as though something was hanging in the balance. He brushed it off as just the stress of the week and made his way to the elevator, greeting his usual staff with a forced smile. The doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, alone. The ride to the top floor felt longer than usual, the tension in the air mounting with each passing floor. When the elevator doors opened, Ethan stepped into the sleek, modern office space of Whitmore Enterprises. His employees, working away in their glass-walled cubicles, barely acknowledged him as he walked by. He was used to that. He was the boss, after all. But as he approached his office, a strange feeling gnawed at him. Something wasn't quite right. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," came a voice from behind him. He turned around, startled. It was his new secretary, Jane. He hadn't expected her to be in so early. In fact, he'd barely had time to meet her properly. Ethan had been caught up with meetings the last few days, and he'd only seen her briefly in passing. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with sharp features and an air of quiet professionalism about her. Today, however, her face held a look of confusion. She was standing by her desk, her fingers frozen on the keyboard, eyes wide as though she had seen a ghost. I wasn't expecting you, sir," Jane stammered, her voice laced with uncertainty. She blinked a couple of times before continuing, her cheeks flushing. "I thought you were the IT technician." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. She didn't recognize him, her boss. His face must have betrayed a flicker of disbelief because she immediately started to apologize. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore. I didn't mean—" Her words trailed off as she stepped forward, clearly embarrassed. Ethan's initial surprise faded into a strange mixture of amusement and frustration. He had spent years building this company. His name was known throughout the industry. He was a recognized figure in the tech world, and yet here was his new secretary, unable to recognize him at first glance. It wasn't as if he was someone who could easily be mistaken for an average tech worker. He was known for his polished suit, his sharp features, and his air of confidence. But there she was, clearly overwhelmed by the fast-paced environment. A mistake that would likely haunt her for the rest of the day. "That's okay," Ethan said, his voice softer than he had intended. He couldn't help but laugh quietly to himself. "It happens." She blinked again, as though trying to process what had just occurred, and then hurried to gather herself. I wasn't sure if you were the one coming in today or—" "No. Worries," Ethan interrupted, offering a reassuring smile. "I was just about to grab a coffee. You want one?" The question seemed to catch Jane off guard, and for a moment she hesitated. But then, in a move that Ethan would later find strangely endearing, she nodded. "Yes, please, I'll join you," she replied, her voice a bit steadier now. Ethan motioned toward the small coffee station near the corner of the office. As they walked toward it, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. He could sense that she was still a bit flustered, but there was something else in the air, A strange energy, almost electric, was swirling between them, and neither of them knew how to address it. It was like an invisible thread pulling them together in a way neither could. "Explain. So how's the first week been?" Ethan asked, trying to break the awkward tension. "It's been good, actually," she answered. "There's a lot to get used to, but I'm learning. I mean, you know how it is. Everything moves so fast around here." "Yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming," Ethan agreed, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He could tell that she was still uneasy, though her body language had relaxed slightly. He glanced at her, her brown hair tied neatly in a ponytail, her eyes bright, but still tinged with uncertainty. She was young, yes, but there was something in the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence, a sharpness that was hard to ignore. And despite the earlier mistake, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else lurking beneath the surface. As they sat down with their coffee, the conversation shifted to work matters. Ethan asked her about her tasks, her progress, and her impressions of the office. She answered thoughtfully, impressing him with her attention to detail. There was no denying that she was smart. Perhaps too smart for a secretary, but that was neither here nor there. Ethan had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and his gut told him that Jane was not like the others. She had potential. After a few more minutes of idle chat, Ethan found himself slipping into his familiar work mode. He was used to having assistants and secretaries, each one coming and going, their time at Whitmore Enterprises fleeting. But there was something different about Jane. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew that something was shifting. That evening, as he left the office, Ethan replayed the events of the day in his mind. The way Jane had mistakenly taken him for the IT technician, the way she'd apologized, the spark between them that seemed to flicker and catch fire, despite how simple the interaction had seemed. He couldn't help but feel drawn to her, though he couldn't explain why. Little did he know that single, seemingly insignificant mistake would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The days following the strange encounter between Ethan Whitmore and his new secretary Jane were filled with a strange tension. As much as Ethan tried to focus on his work, his thoughts kept drifting back to that one moment, the moment when Jane had mistaken him for the IT technician. At first, he had laughed it off, dismissing it as a simple mistake, but the more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. The strange way she had looked at him, the brief flicker of recognition before the apology, and the way her eyes held a curious glint, all of it kept playing in his mind. But it wasn't just that. There was something else. Something about Jane. Ethan couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt an inexplicable pull toward her. He had always been the type of man who kept his emotions in check, preferring to focus on business. But with Jane, things were different. She was intelligent, sharp, and had an energy about her that both intrigued and unsettled him. She was far more than just a secretary. Ethan had worked with plenty of assistants before, but none had ever affected him like this. As the days passed, Ethan found himself looking forward to their brief interactions. They would chat over coffee, exchange pleasantries in passing, but there was always an undercurrent of something more. Every conversation, no matter how casual, seemed to hold an unspoken tension, a sense of anticipation that neither of them acknowledged, and yet both of them could feel it. One morning, Ethan entered the office to find Jane sitting at her desk, her face buried in a pile of paperwork. She didn't hear him approach, and when she finally looked up, there was a moment of awkward silence before she quickly stood up. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an unmistakable nervousness. She had always been polite, but today there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. Her cheeks flushed, and she avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the documents in front of her. "Morning, Jane," Ethan replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. He didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable, But there was something in the air between them that couldn't be ignored. Ethan had always been aware of his position as the CEO of a large corporation. He was used to being the center of attention, used to people looking to him for direction and leadership. But Jane, she didn't look at him like that. She treated him with the same respect she would anyone else. And in a way, it both fascinated and unsettled him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Jane than met the eye. He had learned to read people over the years, and he could tell that she was hiding something. But what? Was it just her nerves or something deeper? Ethan decided to push the thoughts aside for the moment. He had work to do. He sat down at his desk and began sifting through his emails, responding to urgent matters, signing contracts, and handling the usual business of running a multi-million-dollar company. Jane, meanwhile, worked silently at her desk, her attention fully focused on her tasks. But even in the midst of his work, Ethan found himself stealing glances at her. There was something about the way she worked, so absorbed in her duties, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had a quiet intensity about her, one that seemed to match his own. It was both captivating and unnerving. He had never been the type to mix business with personal feelings, but with Jane, it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep the two separate. As the days went on, Ethan found himself growing more and more intrigued by her. She wasn't just the new secretary anymore. She had become something else, someone he couldn't get out of his mind. The tension between them continued to build, and one Friday afternoon, Ethan decided to take a different approach. He'd seen Jane working late into the night for the past few weeks, always dedicated, always on task. He admired that about her, her work ethic, her commitment. But he also knew that she deserved a break. So he invited her to dinner. It wasn't a romantic gesture, at least that's what Ethan tried to convince himself. He simply wanted to acknowledge her hard work and show her that he appreciated everything she had done for the company. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he realized just how wrong that reasoning was. He had invited her out because he wanted to spend time with her. He was curious about her, and that curiosity was starting to turn into something else, something more complicated. When Jane agreed, there was a brief moment of hesitation in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "I'd love to, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice soft but warm. They decided to go to a small, upscale restaurant just a few blocks from the office, a place where they could have a quiet meal without any distractions. Ethan had been there several times before, but this time it felt different. There was an unfamiliar nervousness in the air, a tension that neither of them could deny. As they sat down at a secluded table, Ethan couldn't help but notice how Jane looked in the soft lighting. She had always been attractive, but tonight there was something about her that made her seem even more captivating. She had changed into a simple yet elegant dress, her hair cascading in waves around her shoulders. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he had been this aware of someone's presence. Her every movement, every glance, seemed to draw him in. "So," Ethan began, breaking the silence, "how's everything going? How are you settling in here at Whitmore Enterprises?" Jane smiled, but there was a subtle sadness in her eyes. "It's been great, honestly. I'm learning a lot, but it's not always easy," she said quietly. Ethan leaned in slightly, intrigued by her response. "Why is that? You seem like you've got everything under control." She hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough, like I don't belong here." Ethan was taken aback. He had never once thought that Jane didn't belong. She was sharp, hardworking, and dedicated. In fact, she was one of the few people who impressed him with her intelligence. But hearing her say those words made him realize just how vulnerable she was. He hadn't expected that. He had never seen this side of her, the side that questioned her worth. "You belong here, Jane," Ethan said, his voice sincere. "I wouldn't have hired you if I didn't think so." Jane smiled, but the sadness remained in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. As the evening went on, they continued to talk. About work, about life, about everything, and nothing. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and for the first time, Ethan felt a sense of ease around Jane. There was no pressure, no formalities. It was just the two of them, sharing a quiet moment outside of the office. But as the night wore on, Ethan found himself becoming more and more drawn to her. It wasn't just her beauty or her intelligence. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. She was real. She was genuine. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was seeing someone for who they truly were, not just their position or role in the company. When the evening came to a close, Ethan found himself reluctant to say goodbye. They walked out of the restaurant together, the cool night air refreshing against their skin. As they reached their cars, Ethan turned to her, his heart pounding. "Jane," he said quietly, "I'm glad we did this." She smiled up at him, her eyes soft. "Me too, Mr. Whitmore. Thank you for the dinner." As she drove off into the night, Ethan stood there for a moment, staring after her car. He didn't know what had just happened. But one thing was certain. He couldn't stop thinking about her. In the days that followed their dinner together, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Jane. It wasn't just her intelligence or her work ethic that had impressed him. It was something else, something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. There was a magnetic pull between them that neither had fully acknowledged, yet it lingered in the air every time they spoke or crossed paths in the office. Ethan, a man who had always kept his emotions in check, was finding it harder and harder to maintain his usual detached professionalism. He had spent years building his empire, creating a wall around himself to protect against distractions. But Jane was different. Every conversation with her felt like a thread was being slowly and inevitably pulled towards something more, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He didn't know what it was about her. Maybe it was her sharp wit, her quiet strength, or the way she seemed to see right through him, understanding him in ways others never had. Or maybe it was the way she carried herself, so confident yet so vulnerable, as if she were both strong and fragile at the same time. Whatever it was, Ethan couldn't deny that he was drawn to her in ways he couldn't understand. It was a Friday afternoon when the next turning point in their relationship occurred. Ethan had been buried in meetings all day, but as the hours wore on, he felt a strange restlessness. The typical demands of running Whitmore Enterprises had lost their usual grip on his attention. He glanced at the clock and realized it was nearly 5 p.m., just an hour before he could escape for the weekend. He had already decided to wrap up his day, but then something stopped him. Something made him pause and glance over at Jane's desk. She was sitting there, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her computer screen. Her brow was furrowed, her fingers typing quickly as she sifted through a mountain of emails and reports. It was a routine sight. Jane always worked late, always stayed ahead of her tasks. But today, something seemed different. Ethan noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she clenched her jaw as if trying to hold something back. He had seen her work under pressure before, but tonight it felt like there was more to it. Ethan stood up, his chair scraping against the polished floor as he walked over to her desk. Jane didn't notice him approaching until he was right behind her. She turned to look at him, and for a brief moment her face softened in surprise. "Mr. Whitmore," she asked, her voice faltering slightly. "Is everything all right?" "Yeah, I just noticed you're still here," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You've been working non-stop all week. Are you okay?" Jane's gaze dropped to the desk, avoiding his eyes for a moment. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I'm fine, really," she replied, though her voice lacked the usual confidence. "Just trying to finish up some things before the Weekend. Ethan could tell she was lying. There was something more going on beneath the surface. He'd spent enough time around people to know when they were hiding something, and Jane's unease was too palpable to ignore. "You don't have to work yourself to the bone," Ethan said, his voice gentle yet firm. "Take a break. Go home. You've earned it." She hesitated for a moment, looking at him with uncertainty. Then, as if she had made a decision, she slowly pushed her chair back and stood up. "Maybe I will," she said quietly, though she didn't quite meet his gaze. Ethan felt a twinge of guilt. He hadn't meant to make her feel uncomfortable, but he also knew that he couldn't stand by and watch her push herself beyond her limits. There was something more to Jane's struggle than just work, and Ethan couldn't help but feel an overwhelming need to understand what it was. Before she could leave, he stopped her. "Jane," he said, his voice more urgent now, "what's really going on? You can talk to me, you know. I'm not just your boss." She stood still for a long moment, her back to him, her body tense. Ethan could almost feel her hesitation, her internal battle over whether or not to open up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she turned around to face him. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something deeper, something raw. I don't know if I can do this anymore," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "It's not the job, it's everything. I've been struggling for so long, pretending everything's fine, but it's not. I feel like I'm losing control, like I'm drowning." Ethan's heart tightened at the words. He hadn't expected her to open up like this, but now that she had, he knew he couldn't turn away. He wasn't used to dealing with vulnerability, especially his own, but seeing Jane like this, so honest, so raw, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years: empathy. "I had no idea," he said softly, stepping closer to her. "I'm sorry. You don't have to carry everything on your own. Let me help." Jane shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "You can't help me, Mr. Whitmore. No one can." The words stung, but Ethan didn't back down. He had always been the one people turned to when they needed something, whether it was a solution to a problem or just someone to listen. But here, with Jane, he felt like he had more to offer than just business advice. He wanted to be there, for her in a way he had never been for anyone else. "Don't say that," Ethan said, his voice firm but gentle. "I know you think you have to do everything on your own, but you don't. You're not alone." Jane's eyes flickered with something: hope, fear, vulnerability, but she quickly masked it, turning her gaze to the floor. "I just don't know where to start." Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. He could feel her body tense at the contact, but she didn't pull away. "You start by letting someone in," Ethan said quietly. "You don't have to do this alone, Jane. Let me help you figure it out." For a long moment they stood there in silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Then, slowly, Jane nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, as Ethan left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the vulnerability she had shown him or the way he had offered her his support. It was something deeper, something more profound. Ethan couldn't deny that he was becoming more and more involved in Jane's life, more and more invested in her. She was no longer just his secretary. She was a person he cared about, someone he wanted to protect and understand. And as much as he tried to resist it, the connection between them was undeniable. But he knew one thing for sure. He had to be careful. He couldn't let his feelings get in the way of his judgment, not with so much at stake. The line between professional and personal had always been clear for him, but with Jane, the boundaries were beginning to blur. As Ethan walked out into the cool night air, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. He didn't know where this path would lead, But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was ready to find out. The weeks following Ethan's conversation with Jane were filled with a mix of anticipation, confusion, and uncertainty. Ethan couldn't deny that he was more involved with Jane than he'd ever intended. But each passing day, each shared glance or conversation seemed to draw them closer. It was as though the lines between work and personal life had begun to blur, in a way neither of them had anticipated. Despite Ethan's growing attachment to Jane, he kept his emotions in check, focusing on his responsibilities at Whitmore Enterprises. He couldn't afford to lose control, not when so much was at stake, but Jane had become an undeniable presence in his life. It was more than just the late-night conversations, more than just the gentle touch of her hand on his shoulder. There was something about her, the way she made him feel alive, the way she challenged him to see the world differently, that he couldn't ignore. It was a Wednesday when everything changed. Ethan had arrived at the office early, as he usually did, and was preparing for a critical board meeting that could decide the future direction of his company. The pressure was mounting, the stakes were high, and Ethan was focused on nothing but the numbers and the strategies that lay ahead. But as he entered his office, something caught his eye, something he hadn't expected. There, on his desk, was an envelope. A plain, unmarked envelope that seemed out of place in the otherwise polished and professional atmosphere of his office. Ethan frowned as he picked it up, wondering who could have left it there. He knew that his assistant Jane would never leave something like this lying around without a reason. His fingers brushed over the surface of the envelope, feeling an odd sense of foreboding. Without thinking, he opened it. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper folded neatly. Ethan unfolded it, scanning the words written in elegant yet hurried handwriting. "You don't know who she really is, do you? Keep your distance, or you'll regret it." The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He read them again, feeling a sense of dread that he couldn't explain. Who was this message from, and why was it left for him to find? The handwriting didn't seem familiar, and the message itself was cryptic and ominous. It felt like a warning, one that he couldn't ignore. His mind raced, wondering if this had something to do with Jane. Could it be? The idea seemed absurd at first. Jane had been nothing but professional, nothing but kind and hard-working since she joined Whitmore Enterprises. But the message didn't seem like a random threat. It felt personal. And that made Ethan uneasy as he sat there, staring at the words on the page. The door to his office opened. Jane walked in, her usual composure in place, but something was different about her today. There was a subtle tension in her posture, an unease that Ethan couldn't quite place. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice soft but steady. But when she saw what he was holding in his hand, her expression changed. Her eyes widened just slightly, a flicker of concern passing across her face before she quickly masked it with a smile. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was still trying to process the message. His fingers gripped the paper tightly as he looked up at her, trying to gauge her reaction. Was she hiding something? Did she know more than she was letting on? "Jane," he said, his voice low, "do you know anything about this?" He handed her the note, watching her carefully as she took it from his hands. Her eyes scanned the words quickly, and for the briefest of moments, her face grew pale. But she quickly regained her composure, folding the note back up and handing it back to him. "I don't know who would leave something like this, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice calm but guarded. "I haven't seen that before." Ethan's instincts told him that she was lying. There was something in the way she had reacted, something in her eyes that didn't add up. But he didn't press her for answers. Not yet. He needed more time to figure this out. "All right," he said, his voice steady, though he couldn't quite mask the unease in his tone. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this, but if you remember anything at all, let me know. Jane." nodded quickly, her eyes flickering with something, fear, guilt, or something else. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll keep an eye out." Ethan watched her leave, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily in the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The message seemed to be warning him about Jane, but why? What was going on? He couldn't help but wonder if Jane was hiding something from him. But then he pushed the thought away. Jane had been nothing but professional. She had always been a pillar of reliability. He couldn't jump to conclusions, not yet. The rest of the day was a blur. The board meeting went smoothly, but Ethan found it hard to focus. The message on his desk kept replaying in his mind, and the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. By the time the workday ended, Ethan was exhausted, physically and mentally. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to start. The idea of confronting Jane directly felt wrong. She had been nothing but helpful, and accusing her without proof seemed like a mistake he couldn't afford to make. As he walked to his car that evening, he felt a strange sense of foreboding. The cool night air did little to calm his nerves. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the mystery surrounding Jane and the threatening note was pressing down on him from all sides. When he reached his car, he stopped for a moment, glancing back at the office building. It stood in the distance, its glass windows reflecting the dim light of the street lamps. Ethan had built his empire from the ground up, but now, for the first time, he felt uncertain. He didn't know who to trust, who to turn to. The business he had built, the life he had worked so hard to create, was starting to feel like it was slipping through his fingers. He had to find out the truth, and he had to do it quickly. Over the next few days, Ethan began digging deeper. He spoke to a few of the staff members who had worked closely with Jane, trying to find out if they knew anything that could explain the cryptic message. But every conversation led to the same dead end. No one had any idea about the note, and no one seemed to think there was anything suspicious about Jane. But the more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized that this situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. Whoever had left that message knew something about Jane, or something about him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't until the following Thursday evening that Ethan got his first real breakthrough. He was working late in his office, the silence of the building pressing in on him, when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" Ethan answered, his voice wary. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a voice, a woman's voice, came, through, low and measured. "If you care about Jane, you need to stay away from her," the voice said. "Trust me, you have no idea what you're dealing with. If you don't back off, things will get much worse." Before Ethan could respond, the line went dead. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was spiraling out of control. For days, he had been trying to make sense of the cryptic message, the anonymous phone call, and the undeniable tension that had settled between him and Jane. The deeper he dug, the more he felt like he was uncovering something far bigger and more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. But he couldn't stop. Something in him, perhaps his need for answers, perhaps his growing concern for Jane, kept him moving forward, even when every instinct screamed at him to stay away. The phone call had rattled him. The voice on the other end was calm, almost eerily so, as if the person speaking had known exactly what would push him over the edge. The words had echoed in his mind for days. "If you care about Jane, you need to stay away from her." The warning hung over him like a dark cloud, and despite his best efforts, Ethan couldn't ignore it. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office earlier than usual. His mind was heavy with questions. What had Jane gotten herself into? Who was threatening her, or was the threat directed at him? Was she really involved in something dangerous, or was there another explanation? He didn't know the answers, But he was determined to find them. As he entered his office, he saw Jane already seated at her desk, her focus fixed on the pile of paperwork in front of her. It was a sight he had come to expect. Jane, the dedicated employee, always on top of things, always professional. But today, something was different. There was an unease in the air that neither of them could ignore. Ethan could feel it, even from across the room. For a moment he simply stood there, watching her work, his thoughts racing. Was she hiding something? Had she been aware of the dangers surrounding her? Was this all a game to her? Or was she, like him, caught in a web of secrets and lies that neither of them could escape? Ethan knew he needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. He had to confront Jane directly. "Jane," Ethan called, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. She looked up, surprised, as if she hadn't noticed him standing there. Her eyes were wide, almost as if she'd been lost in thought, but she quickly masked the expression, offering him a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Is there something I can help you with?" Ethan walked over to her desk, standing, tall, as he met her gaze. "We need to talk. It's about the note and the phone call." Jane's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Ethan to notice. She shifted in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as if trying to steady herself. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice soft but guarded. Ethan's heart raced. He had prepared for this conversation, but now that it was happening, he felt the weight of the situation settling over him. He could feel the tension between them, thickening the air around them, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. "The note that was left on my desk," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. "The message warning me to stay away from you. The phone call I received last night. Who was it, Jane? What's going on?" For a long moment Jane said nothing. She didn't move, didn't speak. Ethan could see her internal struggle, her emotions flickering across her face like a storm she was trying to contain. He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that came from holding a dangerous secret, but still she said nothing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the tension. "In the room, I didn't want you to find out like this," she said, her voice trembling. "But I guess there's no avoiding it anymore. I never meant for you to get involved in all of this." Ethan's pulse quickened. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. "Involved in what? What's going on, Jane?" She stood up from her desk, taking a few steps back as if she needed space. Her hands were shaking, and Ethan could see that she was struggling to find the right words. "You have to understand, Mr. Whitmore. This isn't just about you and me. This goes much deeper than that. I never wanted you to be part of it, but now that you know, there's no turning back." Ethan's head was spinning. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "What is going on?" Jane took a deep breath, then looked him squarely in the eye. "I'm not just a secretary, Ethan," she said, her voice now filled with a quiet, almost resigned intensity. "I'm not who you think I am." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He took a step toward her, his mind racing with possibilities. But before he could say anything, Jane continued. "I'm not really Jane Thomas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My real name is Emily Lancaster, and I've been undercover for months. The company you built, Whitmore Enterprises, it's been involved in some very dangerous things I never wanted to be part of, but I was forced to. I've been gathering information, and now that you know, I'm afraid it's too late." Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the shock of her revelation. Everything he thought he knew about Jane, everything he thought he knew about the situation, was crumbling in front of him. His own thoughts were a blur, unable to focus, unable to make sense of what she had just said. You've been spying on me?" he asked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Jane, no." Emily looked away, her eyes filled with guilt. "I didn't want to. I never wanted to hurt you. But I had no choice. They've been watching me, watching everything I do. They told me that if I didn't get the information they needed, they would hurt the people I care about." Ethan's head was spinning. "Who are they? Who's behind this?" Emily shook her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I can't say. I'm not allowed to. If I do, they'll find me. They'll find us both." The room seemed to close in around Ethan. He felt his chest tighten as he struggled to breathe, as if the weight of Emily's confession was pressing down on him. He had been so focused on the business, so caught up in the work, that he hadn't seen the truth staring him in the face. But now, the truth was all too clear. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Ethan asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Why? Didn't you trust me?" "I was scared," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know who to trust. I still don't. And now it's too late." Ethan took a step forward, reaching out to her, his heart torn between anger and sympathy. "We can fix this," he said, his voice firm, determined. "We'll figure it out together." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "You don't understand, Ethan. It's not that simple. They'll come after you too, and when they do, you'll wish you had never gotten involved." Ethan's mind raced. He knew that Emily was right. The situation was more complicated than he could have ever imagined. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let her face this alone, not after everything they had been through, not after everything that had happened. "We'll find a way," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "We'll get through this, together." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. And this time, there would be no turning back. The weight of Emily's confession hung heavily in the air, pressing down on Ethan like a storm waiting to break. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, each one more frantic than the last. Everything he had built, everything he had believed, now seemed to unravel before him. Emily wasn't just his secretary. She wasn't the person he had thought her to be. She was a woman caught in a dangerous game, one that he had unwittingly become a part of. And yet, despite the danger, despite the lies and the secrecy, Ethan couldn't bring himself to turn away. He had come too far. The truth had already come crashing down around them, and there was no turning back. His feelings, for her complicated, intense and raw, had only deepened in the wake of this revelation. She had been through more than he could imagine, and now, with everything out in the open, it was his turn to decide what came next. As the hours passed, Ethan and Emily worked tirelessly together to unravel the tangled web that had ensnared them. Both, he knew that they had little time. The people Emily had been working for were dangerous, far more dangerous than Ethan had ever imagined. He had thought his life was complicated before, but now, with Emily at the center of it all, the stakes had never been higher. That evening, as they sat in Ethan's office, the weight of their situation pressing down on them, Ethan knew they had no time to waste. Emily had given him a vague description of the people who had been pulling the strings, but she had been careful not to give too much away. Her fear was palpable. She knew better than anyone that even one wrong move could lead to disaster. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll be watching. We have to leave the city, find somewhere safe." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and terror. "They'll come after us. They know everything. We can't hide forever." Ethan stood up, pacing the room as he tried to think of their next move. His mind was racing, his thoughts fragmented as he searched for a way out of the nightmare they had found themselves in. He had never felt so helpless in his life. "Then we fight," Ethan said, his voice steady now, with a renewed sense of purpose. "We go after them. We don't let them control us." Emily shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You don't understand. You think this is just about me, about us. But it's bigger than that. They won't stop until they have everything they want." Ethan stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "Then we'll make sure they don't get what they want. We'll fight back, together." There was a long pause as Emily looked at him, her breath shaky. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope. She had been running for so long, hiding in plain sight, terrified of what might happen if her secret came to light. And now, with Ethan by her side, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. "I don't know if we can win," she whispered. "But I'm with you. I trust you." "Ethan, I've trusted you from the moment I met you." Her words hit Ethan harder than he had anticipated. The weight of her trust, the vulnerability she had shown him, made everything feel real. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for her, for everything they had built together. "I promise you," Ethan said, his voice firm, "I'll protect you, no matter what." The next few days passed in a blur of planning and uncertainty. Ethan had reached out to some trusted allies, people he knew he could rely on. Together, they began gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of who was behind the threats. The truth was far more shocking than he could have ever imagined. The people Emily had been working for weren't just criminal operatives. They were powerful individuals who had infiltrated various levels of business and government, manipulating situations to their advantage. Their influence reached farther than anyone had realized. But what was even more chilling was the fact that they had been using Whitmore Enterprises as a pawn in their larger game. Ethan had unknowingly become a part of their plan, and now, with Emily's help, he had to stop them before they destroyed everything he had worked for. As Ethan and Emily worked together, their connection deepened. They spent long hours in his office, going over documents, discussing strategies, and planning their next moves. But it wasn't just the business at hand that kept them close. There was something else, something that neither of them could deny. Their feelings for each other had become undeniable, and yet, as much as they were drawn to one another, they knew that the situation they were in left no room for distractions. Every decision, every move they made could be the difference between life and death. Their survival depended on their ability to stay focused, to remain one step ahead of the people hunting them. It was on the fifth night, after a long day of surveillance and meetings with allies, that Ethan received a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm, and the words it spoke sent a cold shiver down his spine. "You've been asking questions, Ethan. It's time you learned the truth." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone as he listened, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been expecting this call, but the words still hit him harder than he could have imagined. "You don't know who you're dealing with. But I think you're starting to understand," the voice continued. "Emily Lancaster is not just a pawn in our game. She's the key to everything." Ethan's mind raced as the words sank in. He had always known there was more to Emily's story than she had let on. But this was something else entirely. The key to everything? What did that mean? Before he could respond, the line went dead. Ethan stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, his thoughts swirling. He turned to Emily, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, watching him closely. "That was them," Ethan said, his voice tight. "They know we're coming for them. And now, they've revealed something we didn't know." Emily's face went pale, her hands trembling as she stood up. "What did they say?" "They said you're the key to everything," Ethan replied, "that you're more than just a part of their plan. You're the center of it all." Emily's face drained of color as she took a step back, her expression a mixture of fear and realization. I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought I was just helping them. I didn't realize how deep this went." Ethan rushed to her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out. We'll get to the bottom of it." As the days went by, Ethan and Emily worked relentlessly to expose the true nature of the people who had been manipulating them. They dug into the depths of Whitmore Enterprises' financial records, reaching out to contacts in law enforcement and gathering evidence of the conspiracy that had been unfolding behind closed doors. It was a long, dangerous battle, one that would test their resolve, but in the end, it paid off. The people who had been pulling the strings were exposed, their crimes laid bare for the world to see. Whitmore Enterprises, once a pawn in their game, was now free of their influence. And Ethan, with Emily by his side, had regained control of his company, his life, and his future. The final confrontation came swiftly. In a tense standoff, Ethan and Emily, backed by a network of trusted allies, confronted the masterminds behind the conspiracy. There were no words, no negotiations. It was a battle of survival, a final push to reclaim their lives. And when the dust settled, Ethan and Emily stood victorious. The people who had sought to destroy everything they had worked for were brought to justice. As the sun set on the city skyline, Ethan and Emily stood together, their hands clasped tightly in a bond forged in the fire of their struggles. "We made it," Emily whispered, her voice filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with something deeper than words could express. "We did," he said softly, "together." And in that moment, as the world around them began to settle into a new chapter, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they would move forward into the future. A future built on trust, resilience, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places, the end